Welcome to the Willoughby-Eastlake's Public Library's presentation of Tammy's Rose Gardening Series. My name is Tammy and welcome to my rose garden. This installment we will discuss how to prune your roses. In order to prune your roses, you'll need your gardening shears, a pair of scissors, your gloves, and a bucket. And then if you want to put down any food or fertilizer, if you haven't done that already, or if it's time to re-add it to the soil, we'll cover that also. So we have our rose food and our fertilizer and our watering can and our spade and our little rake. So let's get started. Okay, to prune your roses, you'll need your shears and your gloves, and it depends on the type of plant and whether there's damage or disease, how you want to shape the plant, and the time of year in which you're pruning. Because sometimes, like during the summertime, you don't cut out as much compared to like when you do the spring pruning, or if you're a winter pruner, you know, when you cut it back for the winter time, you know, sometimes you cut back more at those times of year. Most of the roses, it's just a simple, you find either the next set of 5 leaves, or in other words, you know, right above the bud eye, which like on here, which this one has 5 leaves, and if you go back to the stem, inside you can see like a little notch. It's this little notchy thing where the leaves come in contact with the stem, and you cut it just like a 1/4 inch, and you cut at a 45-degree angle away from the bush so that the water runs off, and you just snip it like that, and that's all there is to it. And the fact that our new cut has green or white in it, and it's not brown, and it doesn't have a hole in it, that's a good sign. If you do find that when you make your cut, that when you cut that there's still like some type of hole in it, if you're cutting because there's damage, or that there's some type of insect that had gotten into it, then you can still continue to cut back on the plant until you reach this type of tissue. But anyways, we're going to use our Buff Beauty Rose because this one has some damage to it. It has chemical damage because we washed the deck with some cleaner, and some of the cleaner got on the leaves. So it's got some chemical damage. So we're going to cut this part off. But some of the other things that you take into account also is, you know, with most of the rose bushes, they don't grow too tall, you know, and so it may be just a quick, simple, oh, you just cut it back a little bit. During the growing season, it's also, people call it like deadheading too, where you cut off the old flowers, and so you just cut off a little bit as opposed to cutting off a lot. You have to imagine how you want to shape the plant, so you take that into account. If you have a climbing rose, you have to realize that a lot of growth is going to come back. So if you just cut off a little bit, you know that it's going to get real tall again, so you need to cut back more of that. So you have to cut it further down on the plant. So again, more things to take into consideration. Or if there's, again, like we have here, we have damage, or if you have disease, or if you have dead parts, that sometimes with that you have to cut it all the way back to the stem or to the bottom of the plant where the root, the bud union is, the bud union is down here. And you have to also if the stem's too thick, you have to you might need like something like a lopping shear that they use for the tree. So like this part I've never been able to cut off because my shears aren't thick enough to cut through this, so that's why that's always stayed on there. And when you cut, you always cut at a 45-degree angle because you want the water to wash away. You don't cut straight across, or you don't cut up and down. So again, and you cut away from the plant. It's usually a 1/4 inch above where you want to cut, where the bud eye is, and you slope away from the plant because you want the inside of the plant to be open so that it gets air, and that you don't want the branches to crisscross and rub against each other. So again, when the wind blows, that they don't, besides getting the diseases rubbing against each other and the insects and stuff, you also don't get it that when the wind blows that, you know, they damage each other. So what we're going to do here is you cut back to where, on this one, since it's damaged, we're going to cut back to this part because that's where the damage isn't. And see, I'm at an angle and I'm sloping away from the plant, and you just cut like that. And then you can go ahead and put your debris in your bucket. So then, and you always pick up all your debris. So then, if there is any insects or any disease on it, it doesn't hang around to get on the rest of the plant. And this part here looks kind of icky too. So I'm going to cut him off too. And it is important, after you're done pruning something that's diseased, to clean your shears in a bleach solution that's 1 part bleach and like 5 parts water, so that, and to rinse it thoroughly afterwards before you use them again on any of your other roses. I mean, if you use it on something that's damaged, it's not a problem, but if you use it on something that's diseased, you need to clean your shears before you use them again on something else, or use a different pair of shears in order to cut out the diseased parts. Another thing you can do with your roses is, if you find that you have like 3 of them growing, like 3 buds growing at one time, or 2 buds, you can pinch the side buds off, just like this, and that'll give you a bigger flower growing. So it's up to you whether you want bigger flowers or if you want a bunch of little flowers. Cut back on the dead parts of the roses that didn't make it through the winter. And a lot of people like to prune their roses in the fall, but I like to prune mine in the springtime, because you end up having to cut stuff back anyways, because there's certain parts that die off during the winter time sometimes. So on this particular rose, you have this part which has some discolored parts here, which you can tell doesn't have any new growth, compared to this part which does have some new growth coming on it. It has some green parts, and it has some little red nodules on it, like this part and this part, but like this part here doesn't. And just like here, this part doesn't have any new growth either, this part here. So we can go ahead and just like cut this right back to the stem, the main stem, and you cut it at an angle, and just like these parts. And even if you do have things that have some new growth, if you want to shape the rose bush, you can always cut off parts at this point now too to shape it. So, you know, this one looks pretty good, where he doesn't have like a whole lot of cross sections that are going to get into where they're going to rub against each other. Here, this one too is like a yucky part. So, and like this one back here, this one has like an old small flowers on it. Now this here is like turning yellow, so even though it has some new growth, the fact that it's turning yellow really isn't too good of a sign. You know, usually the ones that turn yellow a lot of times end up dying off. So we'll just cut that section off. And he has enough other parts, which are good. And like this all the way down here at the bottom. Cut these parts. There's like this whole part. And like this here, this being split open is kind of weird. So, you know, he has some new growth here, but I don't like how this looks here. So I might want to cut them off like that, just because that's not a good sign either. And since this is like where they're growing, the azaleas are looking good and blooming. As for pruning the azaleas, you need to wait until the flowers die off. Okay, at this point all the flowers have died off on the azaleas, and you can prune back the azaleas. And so you can just go like this and cut off the dead flowers, and you can shape your bush, but you want to make sure that you don't cut off any of the new growth, or like this here. And you do it at this time of year, so then it has time for the rest of the year to set the flowers until next year. And you always want to make sure that you pick up all your debris afterwards, especially with the azaleas, so that it doesn't get any diseases that come up from any debris hanging around. So always make sure you throw your debris out. And the same thing with the roses. Here's our rhododendron, and it's in full bloom, and it follows the rules of the azaleas, and you don't cut off the flowers until after all the flowers die off, and you have to make sure that you pick up all your debris so that the disease doesn't affect the rhododendron. As for our daffodils, the daffodils have dried up, but they're not ready to be cut back yet either. You usually wait to cut your daffodils back until the tips of them start to become yellow, kind of like this. And that's only because this one fell off. But once all the tips get to be real yellow, then you can cut them back, and you can use the scissors to do that. You would use the scissors and you can just cut them, you know, just a little bit above the base of the soil. And it's going to look messy around here for a little while, but the early summer heat will help dry these up around, and it'll, for right now, what it's doing is it's setting things in the bulb for next year. So you just have to put up with the way things look. And some people sometimes will tie their daffodils up with like a band, like a rubber band or something like that, or like the type of band that you use to put like your hair in or whatever. But I usually don't do that. So, but eventually everything will get cleared out of here, you know, usually by sometime next month. And then the same thing goes for your tulips. The tulips follow the daffodil rules, where you wait until they get yellow and then you can cut them, or when they dry out completely, sometimes you can just pull them, like this one. This one's all yellow, and sometimes you could just pull it straight out of the ground like that. So, you know, that you don't even need the scissors. You can just go and just pull it right out. And then you can put it in your bucket, and that helps with the cleanup. We do have a few tulips still blooming, and these are like the late season tulips. So the tulips come in waves. So, and here's one of the daffodils that's completely done. And you can pull that out. And our mums are growing also, but they don't need to flower until the fall. So you can prune these all the way through summer to keep them from getting too tall. All you have to do is snip them off like this, and you can use your scissors to do it, or your pruning shears, but you know, they're real thin, so you can just use this, and you can just snip them off like that, and it's almost like cutting hair. And I usually go down about halfway down, so that they, you know, you have room to grow back up again. And you usually have to do this a couple times throughout the summer because they grow back really fast. And then usually by about August I stop doing that, so then they have time to put in the flowers, or else they start putting in the flowers, you know, during the summertime, and then you don't have any flowers come the fall. And also that way they don't get too big by the time the fall comes, because if they get too tall then they start falling over. So, and if you find old dead parts on them, again, the stems are, you know, thin enough that you can just break off parts of them, like this part, with your fingers. So it's not even like you need any pruning shears to, you know, break them off, especially when you're cleaning them up after like the winter time or anything like that. So, and you just break them off right at the ground level. And if come the fall time, if you do find that your mums are getting out of control and they are flopping over, a lot of times I just use like those plastic wire ties that the electricians use to tie up wires with, electrical wires. That I just feed a bunch of them together and then loop them around all the mums, and then it kind of gives them like a little brace to grow with, you know, and it kind of helps them stand up if you got like a really thick plant and they're all again falling over. As for putting down the fertilizer, if you haven't already done it, or if you're re-adding the fertilizer again for some reason, along with putting down the food, all you have to do is follow the instructions on your bottle of whatever fertilizer that you're using, and you know, you use your spade or your little rake to dig into the ground a little bit, and then you sprinkle some of it in, and then ours says to water it, and then you bury it. And you can do the same thing with the food. Now the food tells us that you only need a little bit. It says about the size of a dime. So we just need a little bit. And again, you can work that in with your little rake. And then again, you can water it, and you can go around and do that with the rest of, you can pull your mulch back over, and you can go around and do that for the whole garden. with our pruning, you're supposed to get, after you deadhead the flower, you usually get new growth within 6 weeks. Thank you for joining us for this presentation of Willoughby-Eastlake Public Library's Tammy's Rose Gardening Series. Join us again next time. We hope to see you then. You can find more programs like this on our YouTube channel, WE Library, or on our library's website, we247.org.